Recently, a young viewer sent me a question dealing with the punishment for petty crimes in Tudor and Elizabethan England and asking about their use of jails and prisons as compared to what we know today. Because of the movies, books, and miniseries that have come out lately depicting burnings, beheadings, hangings, drawings, and quarterings and the like, we are familiar with the punishment for capital crimes in Tudor and Elizabethan England. However, there was a number of petty crimes, and although the crimes were considered petty, their punishment was still very public and very painful. In modern times, we think of a jail as a place where suspects are held awaiting trial or where minor offenders can carry out a sentence of a few weeks or months. Prison is generally reserved for offenders who have been convicted of more serious crimes and who are sentenced to serve a period of incarceration of several years. Most countries have banned physical punishments such as branding, whipping, and the like, and where those punishments are still practiced, they are usually conducted in private. Not so in Elizabethan and Tudor England, where punishment was intended to be both painful and public. Capital punishment was called for in most serious offenses, those offenses that we would now know as felonies. Not just murder, but also robbery, burglary, rape, arson, counterfeiting, and the like. Private or petty crimes received public punishment as opposed to incarceration. Although sometimes incarceration and fines were imposed, the main punishment was the public whipping, display on the pillory, or other punishment that was designed not only to humiliate the offender and to deter like conduct from other people who might see the punishment, but also serve as an indication that the monarch's justice was being done. Every village had its lockup, usually a round structure containing one cell where drunks, vagrants, and other offenders could be locked up until they could be taken before the local magistrate. More serious offenders could also be locked up there until they could be transported to the nearest large town where a justice court sat. In the larger cities, jails were generally places where people who were suspected of petty crimes were held, pending their trial and later their punishment. Prisons were places where people were held, pending trial for more serious, potentially capital crimes, and where they were held, awaiting their punishment. Beginning with sort of the least painful but most humiliating and going up the scale, there were a number of public and painful punishments that could be inflicted on petty offenders in Tudor and Elizabethan England. One of the most common was a form of public penance. Usually the person would be required to stand in a public place, sometimes clad only in their shirt or in their petticoat or chemise, often with a sign around their neck indicating the crime that they had committed, or bearing a lighted candle while their sins were recited aloud by the town crier or some other individual, and or a sermon was preached against the conduct or the crime that they had committed. This was usually reserved for morality offenses such as prostitution or adultery for women, and for heretics who had recanted and repented and thus been spared the death penalty of burning. St. Paul's Cross in London, in the churchyard of Old St. Paul's Cathedral, was one place where such public penances took place in Tudor England, although this was gradually phased out during Elizabethan times. Public penance in the mode of standing in a public place was phased out in favor of another process known as carting. An individual would be placed in a cart, again with a sign around their neck detailing what crime they had committed, and be dragged through the streets of the local neighborhood of the town, often preceded by people clanging on pots and pans and shouting in an attempt to draw attention to the unfortunate person seated in the cart. Neighbors and townspeople would gather around, yell, shout, jeer, laugh, make comments, and throw rotten eggs, vegetables, rocks, or other items at the offender. The intent was to humiliate the person as much as possible. Usually this was practiced on women who had been found prostituting or committing adultery, or women or men who were disturbing the peace by scolding, fighting, and the like. Every town, in addition to their lockup, also had a stocks and a pillory usually in their public square, and often punishments took place on market days to draw the maximum crowd. The stocks was a wooden frame in which a person's head, wrists, and ankles would be locked so that they would be held immobile, and the stocks was often on a raised platform so that it could be visible to the number of people looking on in the village square. With their neck and their wrists locked down, a person was unable to protect their face, and onlookers would feel free to throw rotten vegetables, animal droppings, rocks, rotten eggs, and other garbage at the individual while jeering, whistling, and making comments and making fun of the person who had been sentenced to the stocks. Thus it was humiliating and uncomfortable. However, an even more painful punishment existed, and this was the pillory. In the pillory, the person stood, not sat or squatted, and their neck and two wrists were locked down in a frame. The pillory could also double as a whipping post if lashes or whipping was part of the punishment, or the person could be restrained so that they could be branded, sometimes on the neck or on the forehead or both cheeks. Because of the poor sanitation of the time, these injuries could result in infection, shock, or even death, although this was not always the case. And again, onlookers would stand around throwing rocks, vegetables, rotten eggs, and other garbage, and jeering and making fun of the poor unfortunate person who had been sentenced to the pillory. There was an even more gruesome form of punishment done with the pillory, and this was for people who had either lied under oath in court, called perjury, or who had published seditious tracts or books against the government, or who had published religiously dissenting materials without Crown permission. They would be sentenced to what would be known as cropping. This was where, in addition to standing in the pillory all day or for a number of days, their ears would be nailed to the side of the pillory. Thus, as they stood there all day and became more and more exhausted and weak, the weight of their body would tear at the flesh of their ears and eventually tear off part of the earlobe. Or, at the end of the day, since there was no way to draw the nails out, the ear or part of the ear would simply be lopped off. In addition, to make the punishment more exquisite, sometimes the person would be sentenced to have their entire ear lopped off anyway. The local hangman or executioner was always in charge of administering the punishments, and if he were clumsy enough to sever the temporal artery, which runs close to the base of the ear, death from bleeding out, shock, and trauma could and often did result. Another form of punishment, usually practiced on women who are accused of being common scolds or possibly suspected of witchcraft, was the ducking stool. This was a device that was a chair suspended on a pole over a lake or a body of water, in which the person could be strapped down and then repeatedly dunked up and down several times. It was generally designed to humiliate, but it could result in death if the person was dunked repeatedly or if she was left under water too long and drowned. Another punishment was called whipping at the cart's tail, and this was particularly practiced in the city of London, where a individual would be sentenced to be stripped at the waist, their hands bound to the tailgate of a cart, and a horse would be led at a walking pace. One or two executioners would follow the cart, and every so often would administer a whip stroke to the condemned person's bare back. They were specifically instructed to use the whips in such a way that the person's back became bloody. The justices would often specify a route through the city, and sometimes the route would be a circuitous one that could be completed for several laps depending on how severe the punishment was intended to be. This punishment was particularly used on religious dissenters. Because a cart was used so often in many of these punishments, either as part of the punishment itself or as a way to haul the person to and from the gallows or the scaffold, the expression to be in the cart came to be synonymous with being in trouble. This is just just a few examples of punishment in Tudor and Elizabethan England. Another punishment that was sometimes given to counterfeiters or to murderers who had been pardoned was to be branded on the thumb. Other people could be sentenced, if they had written libelous or seditious information, to have their right hands cut off. And again, death from shock and trauma could result. So life in those times was very grim, and punishment was intended to be very public and to be very painful and provide the most pain and humiliation possible. Anyway, I thank you for your question and your interest in my channel, and anyone else who has a question about history, the life and times past of any era, ask me history stuff.